Chapter 3 of The Jungle Girl by Gordon Casserly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Love Song of Har Dyal. The bugler was sounding the second mess call as the resident's carriage drew up before the steps of the mess veranda on which stood all the officers of the regiment, dressed in the white drill uniform worn at dinner in India during the hot weather. From the carriage Major Norton, a stout middle-aged man in civilian evening dress, descended stiffly and shook hands with the commandant of the battalion, Colonel Trevor, who had come down the steps to meet him and whose guest he was to be. On the veranda, Wargrave was introduced to him by the colonel and took his outstretched hand with reluctance, for Frank felt stirring in him a faint jealousy of the man who was Violet's legal lord and an infinite hostility to him for not appreciating his charming wife as he ought. And while the resident was shaking hands with the others, Wargrave looked at him with interest. Major Norton was a very ordinary looking man, more elderly in appearance than his years warranted. He was bald and clean shaved, but for scraps of side whiskers that gave him a resemblance to the traditional stage lawyer of amateur theatricals, a likeness increased by his heavy and prosy manner. It was hard to believe that he had ever been a young subaltern, though such had once been the case, for the Indian political department is recruited chiefly from officers of the Indian Army. But he was never the gay and light-hearted individual that most junior subs are at the beginning of their career. Even then he had been a sober and serious individual, favorably noted by his superiors as being earnest and painstaking. And now he was well thought of by the heads of his department, for his plodding and methodical disposition and his slavish adherence to the rules and regulations had earned him the reputation of being an eminently safe man. How such a gay, laughter-loving, coquettish, and attractive woman as Violet Deering came to marry one so entirely her opposite puzzled everyone who did not know the inner history of a girl, one of a large family of daughters, given her chance in life by being sent out to relatives in Calcutta for one season, with a definite warning not to return home unmarried, under penalty of being turned out to face the world as a governess or hospital nurse. And Violet liked comfort and hated work. During dinner Wargrave found himself instinctively criticizing Norton's manner and conversation, and rapidly arrived at the conclusion that Raymond had described him accurately. The resident, though a very worthy individual, was undoubtedly a bore, and Colonel Trevor, beside whom he sat, strove in vain to appear interested in his conversation, for he had heard his opinions on every subject on which Norton had any opinions over and over again. As the resident was the only other European in the station, he dined regularly at the mess on the weekly guest night with one or other of the officers. He was not popular among them, but they considered it their duty to be victimized in turn to uphold the regiment's reputation for hospitality, and in consequence each resigned himself to act as his host. After dinner, as the resident played neither cards nor billiards, The colonel sat out on the veranda with him, all the while longing to be at the bridge table instead, and, as his guest was a strict teetotaler, he did not like to order a drink for himself, so he tried to keep awake and hide his yawns while listening to a prosy monologue on insects until the Residency carriage came to take Major Norton away. When his guest had left, the colonel entered the anteroom heaving a sigh of relief. "Phew! Thank God that's over!" he exclaimed piteously. "Really, Norton becomes more of a bore every day. I'm sick to death of hearing the life story of every Indian insect for the 100th time. I'll dream of Coloperta and Polyoptera and other weird beasties tonight." The other officers looked up and laughed. Ross rose from the bridge table and said, "Come and take my place, sir. We've finished the rubber. Have a drink. You want something to cheer you up after that infliction. Boy, whiskey soda. Commanding Sahib Kiwaslau. Bring a whiskey and soda for the commanding officer." "You've my entire sympathy, Colonel," said Major Hepburn, the second in command. "It's my turn to ask the resident to dinner next. I feel tempted to go on the sick list to escape it." "I say, sir, I've got a good idea," said an Irish subaltern named Daly, who was seated at the bridge table. "Couldn't we pass a resolution at the next mess meeting that in future no guests are ever to be asked to dinner? That will save us from our weekly penance." The others laughed, but the colonel, whose sense of humor was not his strong point, took the suggestion as being seriously meant. "No, no, we couldn't do that," he said in an alarmed tone. "The resident would be very offended and might mention it to the general when he comes here on his annual inspection." The remark was very characteristic of Colonel Trevor, who was a man who dreaded responsibility and whose sole object in life was to reach safety the time when, his period of command being finished, he could retire on his full pension. He was always haunted by the dread that some carelessness or mistake on his part or that of any of his subordinates might involve him in trouble with his superiors and prevent that happy consummation of his 30 years of Indian service. This fear made him merciless to anyone under him whose conduct might bring the censure of the higher authorities on the innocent head of the commanding officer, who was in theory responsible for the behavior of his juniors. It was commonly said in the regiment that he would cheerfully give up his own brother to be hanged to save himself the mildest official reprimand. Perhaps he was not altogether to blame, for he was not his own master in private life. It was hinted that Colonel Trevor commanded the battalion, but that Mrs. Trevor commanded him, and unfortunately there was no doubt that this lady interfered privately a good deal in regimental matters, much to the annoyance of the other officers. Now, relieved of the incubus that hitherto spoiled his enjoyment of the evening, the colonel gratefully drank the whiskey and soda brought him by Rose's order, and sat down cheerfully to play bridge. He always liked dining in the mess, where he was a far more important person than he was in his own house. It did not take Wargrave long to settle down again into the routine of regimental life and the humdrum existence of a small Indian station, but he had never before been quartered in so remote and dull a spot as Rohar. The only distractions it offered besides the shooting and pig sticking were two tennis afternoons weekly, one at the Residency, the other at the mess. Here the dozen or so Europeans, who knew every line of each other's faces by heart, gathered regularly from sheer boredom, whether the game amused them or not. Neither Mrs. Trevor nor her bosom friend Mrs. Baird, the regimental surgeon's better half, ever attempted it, but they invariably attended and sat together, usually talking scandal of Mrs. Norton as she played or chatted with the men. Mrs. Trevor's chief grievance against her was that the general commanding the division, when he came to inspect the battalion, took the younger woman in to dinner, for, as her husband the resident was the viceroy's representative, she could claim precedence over the wife of a mere regimental commandant. No English village is so full of petty squabbles and malicious gossip as a small Indian station. Like every one else in the land, Wargrave hated most those terrible hours of the hot weather between 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. He and Raymond passed them, like so many thousands of their kind elsewhere, shut up in their comfortless bungalow, which was darkened and closely shuttered to exclude the awful heat and the blinding glare outside. Too hot to read or write, almost to smoke, they lay in long cane chairs, gasping and perspiring freely, while the whining punkah overhead barely stirred the heated air. One exterior window on the windward side of the bungalow was filled with a thick mat of dried and odorous couscous grass, against which every quarter of an hour the beastie threw water to wet it thoroughly, so that the hot breeze that swept over the burning sand outside might enter cooled by the evaporation of the water. But Frank found alleviation and comfort in frequent visits to the Residency, where Mrs. Norton and he spent the baking hours of the afternoon absorbed in making music or singing duets, for Violet had a well trained voice which harmonized well with his. No thought of sex seemed to obtrude itself on them. They were just playmates, comrades, nothing more. Yet it was only natural that the woman's vanity should be flattered by the man's eagerness to seek her society, and by his evident pleasure in it. And it was delightful to have at last a sympathetic listener to all her little grievances, one who seemed as interested in her petty household worries or the delinquencies of her London milliner in failing to execute her orders properly as in her greater complaint against the fate that condemned a woman of her artistic and gaiety-loving nature to existence in the wilds and to the society of persons so uncongenial to her as were the majority of the white folk of Rohar. To a man the role of confidant to a pretty woman is pleasant and flattering, and Wargrave felt that he was highly favored by being made the recipient of her confidences. It never occurred to him that there might be danger in the situation. He regarded her only as a friend in need of sympathy and help. His chivalry was up in arms at the thought that she was not properly appreciated by her husband, who, he began to suspect, was inclined to neglect her and treat her as a mere chattel. The suspicion angered him. True, Violet had never definitely told him so, but he gathered as much from her unconscious admissions and revered her all the more for her bravery in endeavoring to keep silent on the subject. Certainly Major Norton did not seem to him to be a man capable of understanding and valuing so sweet and rare a woman as this. After their introduction, in the mess, Frank's next meeting with him was at his own table at the Residency, when in due course Wargrave was invited to dinner after his duty call. Raymond was asked as well, and the two subalterns were the only guests. Their hostess looked very lovely in a Paris made gown of a green shade that suited her coloring admirably. England did not seem to the young soldiers so very far away when this charming and exquisitely dressed woman received them in her large drawing room, from which all trace of the East in furniture and decoration was carefully excluded. For the English in India try to avoid in their homes all that would remind them of the land of exile in which their lot is cast. Major Norton came into the room after his guests, muttering an intelligible apology. He shook hands with them with an abstracted air, and failed to recall Wargrave's name. At table he asked Frank a few perfunctory questions, and then wandered off into his inevitable subject, etymology. But finding him ignorant of and uninterested in it, he engaged in a desultory conversation with Raymond. He soon tired of this, and for the most part ate his dinner in silence. He never addressed his wife, and Wargrave, watching him, pitied her if her husband was as little companionable at meal times when they were alone. He pictured her sitting at table every day with this abstracted and uncommunicative man, whose thoughts seemed far from his present company and surroundings, and who was scarcely likely to exert himself to talk to and entertain his wife when he made so little effort to do so to his guests. Determined that on this occasion at least his hostess should be amused, Frank did his best to enliven the meal. He described to her as well as he could all that he remembered of the latest fashions in England, told her the plots of the newest plays at the London theatres, repeated a few laughable stories to make her smile, and provoked Raymond, who had a dry humor of his own, to a contest of wit. Between them the two subalterns brightened up what had threatened to be a dull evening. Mrs. Norton laughed gaily and helped to keep the ball rolling, and even the host in his turn woke up and actually attempted to tell a humorous story. It certainly lacked point, but he seemed satisfied that it was funny, so his guests smiled as in duty bound. But Wargrave noted Mrs. Norton's look of astonishment at this new departure on the part of her husband, and thought that there was something very pathetic in her surprise. When the meal was ended, she laughingly declined to leave the men over their wine, and stayed to smoke a cigarette with them. When they all quitted the dining room, the resident asked his guest to excuse him for returning to his study, pleading urgent and important work, and his wife led the subalterns up to the drawing room and out on to the veranda that ran alongside its French windows. Here easy chairs and a table with a big lamp had been placed for them. As soon as they were seated, one of the stately Chuprasis brought coffee, while another proffered cigars and cigarettes and held a light from a silver spirit lamp. Then both the solemn servitors departed noiselessly on bare feet. After some conversation, Mrs. Norton said to the adjunct: "Do you remember, Mr. Raymond, that you have promised to take me out shooting one day?" "I haven't forgotten," he replied, "but I was not able to arrange it, as the Maharajah had pig sticking meets fixed up for all our free days. But I don't think we'll have another for some time, for I hear that his Highness is laid up from the effects of his fall, so we might go out some day soon." "Good. When shall we go?" asked Wargrave. "Let's fix it up now." "What about next Thursday?" said his friend, turning to Mrs. Norton. "Yes, that will suit me. Where shall we go?" "There are a lot of partridge and a few hares, I'm told, near the tank at Marwa, where there is a good deal of cultivation," answered Raymond. Then turning to his friend, he continued: "You are not very keen on small game shooting, Frank, so you can bring your rifle and try for Chinchera. I saw a buck and a couple of doe there not very long ago. A little venison would be very acceptable in mess." "The tank is about 8 miles away, isn't it?" said the hostess. "I'll write to the Maharajah and ask him to lend us camels to take us out. My cook will put up a good cold lunch for us." She rose from her chair and continued: "Now, Mr. Wargrave, come and sing something. I've been trying over those new songs of yours to day." She led the way into the drawing room, and Raymond was left alone on the veranda, to smoke and listen for the rest of the evening, while the others forgot him as they played and sang. Suddenly he sat up in his chair, and with a queer little pang of jealousy in his heart, stared through the open window at the couple at the piano. He watched his friend's face turn eagerly towards his hostess. Wargrave was gazing intently at her in a voice full of feeling and pathos, a voice with a plaintive little tone in it that thrilled him strangely. She sang that haunting melody, the love song of her Dyal. Wistfully, sadly, she uttered the sorrowful words that Kipling puts into the mouth of the lovelorn Pathan maiden: "My father's wife is old and harsh with years, And drudge of all my father's house am I. My bread is sorrow and my drink is tears. Come back to me, beloved, or I die. Come back to me, beloved, or I die." And the singer looked up into the eager eyes bent on her and sighed a little as she struck the final chords. Out on the veranda Raymond frowned as he watched them and wondered if this woman was to come between them and take his friend from him. Just then the barefooted servants entered the room, carrying silver trays on which stood the whiskies and sodas that are the stirrup cups, the hints to guests that the time of departure has come, of dinner parties in India. As the two subalterns drove home in Raymond's trap through the hot Indian night, under a moon shining with a brilliance that England never knows, Wargrave hummed the love song of Har Dyal. Suddenly he said: "She's wonderful, Ray, isn't she? Fancy such a glorious woman buried in this hole and married to a dry old stick like the resident. Doesn't it seem a shame?" The adjutant mumbled in an incoherent reply behind his lighted cheroot. Arrived in their bungalow, they undressed in their rooms and in pajamas and slippers came out into the compound, where on either side of a table on which was a lighted lamp stood their bedsteads, the mattress of each covered with a thin strip of soft china matting, for in the hot weather in many parts of India this must be used to lie upon instead of a linen sheet, which would become saturated with perspiration. Looking carefully at the ground over which they passed for fear of snakes, they reached and lay down on their beds, over each of which a punkah was suspended from a crossbeam supported by two upright posts sunk in the ground. One rope moved both punkahs, and the motive power was also supplied by a coolie who, salamaning to the sahibs and seating himself on the ground, picked up the end of the rope and began to pull. Raymond put out the lamp. Wargrave stared up at the moon for a while. Then he said, "I say, Ray, didn't Mrs. Norton look lovely tonight? Didn't that dress suit her awfully well?" "Oh, go to sleep, old man. We've got to get up in a few hours for this confoundedly early parade. Good night," growled the adjutant, turning on his side and closing his eyes. But he listened for some time to his friend humming the love song of Har Dyal again, and not until Frank was silent did he doze off. An hour later he woke up suddenly, bathed in perspiration and devoured by mosquitoes, for the punkahs were still. The coolie had gone to sleep. He called to the man and aroused him. Then, before shutting his eyes again, he looked at his companion. The moon shone full on Wargrave's face. He was sleeping peacefully and smiling. Raymond stared at him for a few minutes. Then he muttered inconsequently, "Confound the woman!" and closing his eyes resolutely, he fell asleep. In the days that elapsed before the shoot at Marwa, Wargrave rode every afternoon to the Residency with the cease, carrying his violin case, except when tennis was to be played. In their small community this could not escape notice and comment. Not that it occurred to him to try and avoid either. The resident did not object to the frequency of his visits, and Frank saw no harm in his friendship with Mrs. Norton. But others did, and the remarks of the two ladies of his regiment on the subject were venomously spiteful. But their censure was reserved for the one they termed "that shameless woman," for like everyone else they were partial to Wargrave and held him less to blame. His brother officers, although being men they were not so quick to nose out a scandal, could not help noticing his absorption in Mrs. Norton's society. One afternoon his double company commander, Major Hepburn, walked into the compound of Raymond's bungalow and on the veranda shouted the usual Anglo Indian caller's demand: "Boy, ko hai? Is anyone there?" A servant hurried out and salamaning answered, "Adjutant Sahib hai. The adjutant is here." "Oh, come in, Major," cried Raymond, rising from the table at which he was seated drinking his tea. "Don't get up," said Hepburn, entering the room. "Is Wargrave in?" No, sir. He went out half an hour ago. Confound it! It seems impossible ever to find him in the afternoon nowadays, said the Major petulantly. I wanted him to get up a hockey match against number 3 double company today. He used to be very keen on playing with the men, but since he came back from England he never goes near them. Where is he? Poodle faking at the Residency as usual? This is the term contemptuously applied in India to the paying of calls and other social duties that imply dancing attendance on the fair sex. I didn't see him before he went out, sir, was Raymond's equivocal reply. He loyally evaded a direct answer. Hepburn shook his head doubtfully. I'm sorry about it. I hope the boy doesn't get into mischief. Look here, Raymond, you're his pal. Keep your eye on him. He's a good lad, and it would be a pity if he came to grief. The adjunct did not answer. The major put on his hat. Well, I suppose I'll have to see to the hockey myself. He left the bungalow with a curt nod to Raymond, who watched him pass out through the compound gate. Then the adjunct walked over to Wargrave's writing table and stood up again in its place a large photograph of Mrs. Norton, which he had hurriedly laid face downward when he heard Hepburn's voice outside. He looked at it for a minute, then turned away frowning. When the morning of the shooting party arrived, Wargrave and Raymond, having sent their syce on ahead with the guns, rode at dawn to the Residency. In front of the building a group of camels lay on the ground, burbling, blowing bubbles, grumbling incessantly, and stretching out their long necks to stamp viciously at anyone but their drivers that chanced to come near them. At the hall door Mrs. Norton stood, dressed in a smart and attractive costume of khaki drill, consisting of a well-cut, long frock coat and breeches, with the neatest of cloth gaiters and dainty but serviceable boots. To their surprise her husband was with her and evidently prepared to accompany them, for he wore an old coat, knickerbockers and puttees. From a strap over his shoulder hung a specimen box, and he was armed with all the requisite appliances for the capture and slaughter of many insects. Avoiding the camel's vicious teeth, the party mounted after exchanging greetings. Mrs. Norton and Wargrave rode the same animal, and Frank, unused to this form of locomotion, took a tight grip as the long-legged beast rose from the ground in unexpected jerks and set off at a jolting walk that shook its riders painfully. Then it broke into a trot equally disconcerting, but finally settled into an easy canter that was as comfortable a motion as its previous paces had been spine dislocating. The route lay at first over a space of desert which was unpleasant, for the sand was blown in clouds by a high wind, almost a gale. But the camels were fast movers, and it did not take very long before they were passing through scrub jungle and finally reached the wide stretch of cultivation near Marwa. The tank, as lakes are called in India, lay in the center of a shallow depression, the rim of which all round was about 400 yards from the water, which, now half a mile across, evidently filled the whole basin in the rainy season. The strong breeze churned its surface into little waves and piled up masses of froth and foam against the bending reeds at one end of the tank, where, about 50 yards from the water's edge, stood a couple of thorny trees, offering almost the only shade to be found for a long distance around. In the shadows were many young egrets, while a saurus crane stalked solemnly along the far bank, and everywhere bird life, rare elsewhere in the state, abounded. The land all about was green, a refreshing change from the usual sandy and parched character of most of the country. But beyond the tank the fields stretched away out of sight. At the edge of the cultivation the camels were halted and the party dismounted from them and separated. Mrs. Norton, who was a fair shot and carried a light 12-bore gun, started to walk up the partridges with Raymond, while her husband went to search the reeds and the borders of the lake for strange insects. Wargrave, armed with a sporting Mannlicher rifle, set off on a long tramp to look for chicera, which are pretty little antelope with curving horns. The wind, which was freshening, prevented the heat from being excessive. The sport was fairly good. When lunch time came the adjutant and Mrs. Norton had got quite a respectable bag of partridges and a few hares. The entomologist was in high spirits, for he had secured two rare specimens, and Wargrave had shot a good buck. So in a contented frame of mind all gathered under the trees near the end of the tank, where lunch was laid by a couple of the Residency servants on a white cloth spread on the ground. As they ate their tiffin lunch, the members of the party chatted over the incidents of the morning, and each related the story of his or her sport. After the meal, Mrs. Norton decided to rest, for the ride and the long walk with her gun had tired her. The servants spread a rug for her under the trees, and placed a camel's saddle for her to recline against. Then, carrying away the empty dishes, plates, glasses, and cutlery, they retired out of sight. "Are you sure you don't mind being left alone, Mrs. Norton?" asked Wargrave. "Not in the least. Do go and shoot again," she replied, smiling up at him. "I'm very comfortable, and I'm glad to have a good rest before undertaking that tiresome ride back. It's very pleasant here. The wind comes so cool and fresh off the water. Isn't it strong, though?" The breeze had freshened to a gale, and under the trees the temperature was quite bearable. The resident had already gone out of sight, over the rim of the basin, having exhausted the neighborhood of the tank, and being desirous of searching farther afield. Wargrave and Raymond now followed him, but soon separated, the latter making for the cultivation again, while his friend set off for the open plain. Ordinarily the heat would have been intense, for the hours after noon up to 3 o'clock or later are the hottest of the day in India, but the gale made it quite cool. To Wargrave, tramping about unsuccessfully this time, came frequently the sound of Raymond's gun. "Ray seems to be having all the luck," he thought, as through his field glasses he scanned the plain without seeing anything. "I'm getting fed up." At last in despair he shouldered his rifle and turned back. After a long walk he came in sight of the adjutant standing near the edge of the fields talking to Norton. When Frank reached him he found that his friend had increased his bag very considerably. "Well done, old boy! You'd better luck than I had," he said. Then turning to the resident he continued, "How have you done, sir?" "Nothing of any value," replied Norton. "Have you finished? We're thinking of going back now." "Yes, sir, I am through. By Jove, I'm thirsty. I could do with a drink. Couldn't you, Ray?" "Rather. My throat's like a lime kiln. We'll join Mrs. Norton and then have an iced drink while the camels are being saddled." They strolled towards the lake, which was hidden from their view by the rim of the basin. As they reached the slight ridge that made all three stop dead and gazed in amazement. As they reached the slight ridge that this made all three stopped dead and gazed in amazement. "What's happened to the tank?" exclaimed Raymond. "The water's almost up to the trees." "Good God! My wife! Look, look!" cried the resident. They stood appalled. The wide body of water had swept up to within a few yards of the trees under which Mrs. Norton lay fast asleep, and stealthily emerging from it a large crocodile was slowly, cautiously crawling towards the unconscious woman. End of chapter 3.